To understand about open authentication, we need to first see that there are two parts to it. On one side, you have our client applications. It could be anything. It could be a web, mobile, or desktop application, which is basically our client. And on the other side, we have server. So our client will be dealing with the server for authentication process. To explain it in a very simple way, we will just enact how the conversation will happen. We will just imagine that these are all some persons talking to each other. How will they be discussing? So on first instance or first step, the client will just call the Google server and say, hey, a user has come to me and he has said that he has an account with you, and I just want you to validate that. The client calls the Google server and says, I have a person who is claiming that he has an account with you, and these are the scopes that he is requesting. And then the server says, okay, so you tell me that there is a person, a user who claims to have an account with me. Okay, how do I know that he has an account with me? So you do one thing, go to your user and confirm that he has an account with me with this login page. So server returns back a login page. In our case in Google, it returns back a login page, and now your client receives this login page. Now let us introduce the user. Let's call him as Joe. The client will go to the user Joe and say, okay, Joe, you tell me that you have an account with Google server. Okay, he has sent me this login page. Why don't you prove yourself? Just enter your user credentials and approve it. That's the third step. And then user says, okay, you want me to prove myself? I will enter my username, password, and this is it. This is my grant info. I already approved myself with Google server. This is the grant info. Just take this grant info and go back to Google server and deal whatever you want to do. And then the client will go to the server and say, hey, I received the grant info from my user. And then the server validates the grant info and everything is in order, and server says, okay, so I approve it. So you have a valid user who has a very genuine account with me. So this is access token. I use this token and you do whatever you want. And then it returns back with a token. Now client does not need to go to the user every time and then show him with a login page for all the requests, because that was done in step 2 and 3. Now every authorization is done. We are now provided with an access token. This is kind of like a entry pass for the subsequent or the future request. So once the access token is issued to the client, now the client can do queries to the server which are falling within the scope that we did in the first step. For instance, the scope could be anything. Like the scope could be like, okay, the user says, I am granting the permission to the client to do scope 1, access my name, scope 2, access my photos, scope 3, access the files in my account. So those are the scopes the user gave grant to in step number 4. Within the scope, now the client can get all the information within the scope from the server without waiting for the user authentication every time, because we already have the access token. For instance, the client will ask the server, what is my name? Like when I say what is my name, it is what is the user's name. Server will now check the access token which comes with that, and then says, okay, access token is valid, and the client is asking what is the name of the user. So since the access token is valid, which means the user has already approved it. Now whether the access token, I can give the user's name within the scope. It goes to step number 1 and sees the scope. Okay, so in this scope I can give him. So it says, hey, your name is Joe. So that's it. Using the access token, I got my first information, and then again I can use repeat the step number 7 and 8 and say, okay, the client will send what is my picture, what is the files. Maybe I will try the client will try to access something like what is the user password, and then the server says, no, the user password is not within the scope, I will not share you the user password, this is denied. So this is the basic way how the whole open authentication happens. So when we look into this client, user, server, and all these things, we can see that there are three entities in play. Let us take the step number 1, 2, 5, and 6. These steps. So we could clearly see that what are we doing here? We are only dealing with authorization. We are requesting the scope. we are getting the approval page, we are granting the info, and finally we are dealing with access token. So these steps we are dealing with an entity called authorization server. And then look at the steps number 3 and 4, this one. So what are we doing here? We are dealing with the user for getting his permission. So basically what we are doing here is we are dealing with an entity called as a resource owner. So resource owner is nothing but a person, user whose account is with the server, from where the application needs to get the resources, like whether the picture is a resource, or name, or email, or maybe in case of a Google Drive, the files present there. So those are the resources which are present in a resource server, from where the resource owner is giving authorization. So when we look into step number 7 and 8, these we are dealing with an entity called as a resource server. So basically in open authentication, there are three entities that our application deals with: an authorization server, resource server, and a resource owner. So resource owner is clear because he or she is the person who is the owner of the resource. But this other two, authorization server and the resource server, are a little unclear, because most of the time we will not be having or knowing the differentiation between these two, because to us we are calling the APIs for authorization, and then we are calling another set of APIs for accessing the resource. That's what happens most of the times. You will not find the difference, but there is a difference between authorization server and resource server. Let us take this example. Google has different entities. It has Google Drive, it has Gmail, it has G Cloud, and it also has YouTube. So YouTube is not a part of Google from the beginning. It was acquired by Google in 2006. YouTube was founded in 2005, and Google acquired it a year later. So which means that these two are two different servers with two different database sets. But once it is a single company, with Google login, you can access the information or your videos or details from YouTube server. So this is what we mean by two different servers. You can set up authorization with Google server, and user authorizes it. Then you can use that information access token, and you can get the information from a resource server, which is nothing but your YouTube. So most cases you will not be feeling any difference, but this is just for your understanding that there are three entities at play. Let us go back to this initial step. Just look at step number 1 now. This is looking isolated. So let us just discuss about this in detail. So let us focus here what's happening. Now, the client itself is telling the Google server that I have a user with this scope and request, so can you just approve it? What if at a later stage this client turns out to be someone suspicious, someone with a malicious intent? So the client is not a genuine application. So it is a malicious intent application which tries to steal your data. So without knowing about this client, the user just gives his username and password, and then the user realizes, no, 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 I made a serious grave mistake. Let me go back to my server and then just revoke this success. So the user comes back to the server and says, hey, sometime back the client came to me with this login page. I gave him the password. I made a mistake. I should not have given him that access. So please revoke that. And then the Google server says, no, I don't know. I don't have any information about the client. This is a very bad scenario because the server has no idea about client. The client cannot just like that come and request for the scope, and the server cannot give the access token back, because at any time as a user, the user will have the full authority or the rights to go back to the server and revoke the access token that was granted to the client. So there is a possibility. So this is one of the very important thing in an open authentication protocol. The server should, I repeat again, the server should have a prior knowledge about the client. This is a very important and a mandatory step. There are several benefits to it. One, the resource owner can always revoke the access, and resource owner have full authority over to whom, to which application the resource owner can grant his access. So that is the first benefit. And second important benefit is to protect the server itself. What if there is no prior knowledge about the client itself? What happens? Then even as a developer, I can create or set up a console application in C sharp and just spam the Google server, raising millions of requests per second. It is a possibility. So when something like this happen, the server will be brought down because it doesn't know from where the client application. Maybe it can deal with the IP address, but then again, still any client can be requesting to the Google server and spamming it. So to avoid this, if a client or if the server believes that a client is trying to misuse this, it can easily just stop this client, provided the server knows something about the client in the first place. So because of this, there is a very crucial step, or the most important step, before the open authentication itself begins, which is called as client registration. So each client application that we develop should be registered with the server. The server should know that there is a client which at a later stage might come back with this request or scope or whatever it is. Now this is not something that is only limited to uh, open authentication 2.0, because this is the same case for open authentication 1.0 as well, and it is also the same case for other protocols like single sign-on SSO, also follows the same protocol. All the applications should first register themselves with the server before they can raise these requests. What happens during this registration process? The server will issue a client ID and a secret to the client. So for any request, the first step, the client should send in its ID and the secret and say, hey, I am the client with this is my ID, this is my secret. So client should first validate itself before it is raising the request. So this is the most important and the first step. So now that we know that the client registration process, we could see that overall there are several credentials in place, several credentials in action. One, the user enters his username password, the client itself shares his client ID password, and then the access token. But out of all these things, the application itself will have access to only two items. One is the client ID with credentials, which is nothing but its ID and secret, and the second one is the access token provided by the server. Now this client credentials are very crucial and important, because you, as an application, maybe it is an Android app or a web app, or for web app this is a little bit okay, but for desktop applications and Android applications, you will be giving your application directly to the user's device. So which means that they will have, there is a possibility they can decompile or look into the code. It is still a possibility. So the client secret should, I repeat again, never reside within your application. There is a queue here which is secret. The name itself is secret because it should be kept a secret. You should not be putting that client secret inside your application. It should be handled separately in a secure server. So each client will have a secret. You need to keep that secret a secret and keep it in a secure server. So it an a desirable or an ideal application would be when the user tries to log in using his social account, a Google account, it will then communicate this information to the server, a secure server. Then the server will communicate with the Google server and share its client secret and get this login page and return it back to the user, and then again the user's grant will be sent back to the server. So this is some steps that as a developer you need to take to protect your secrets. So that's it. This is all about open authentication. This is a very basic and a bare minimum information. If you wish to learn more about open authentication, I will suggest taking a look at this URL. I will post this URL in the description. So just take a look into it.